A major new escalation, but also a developing one. To get reaction on this, I'm joined live by a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Malcolm Davis. Malcolm, we knew that a response was coming by the US following the attacks on this base that killed 3 US soldiers in northeast Jordan and wounded others. Your response initially to what's just happened overnight?
Well, look, I think it was pretty much what I expected. I did have some misgivings about the delay in responding, and also the way the Biden administration telegraphed its intent to the Iranians, to the point whereby the senior Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders and personnel and the militias could essentially safely evacuate from Iraq and Syria into Iran. So in a sense, by telegraphing that attack, that reduced the effectiveness of that attack in one sense. But the Americans are very keen to avoid escalation here. And so what they didn't want to do was inflict heavy casualties on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in particular, that would then force Iran to retaliate. I still think the Iranians, through their proxies, will retaliate at some point. This is certainly not over. And, the Biden administration is making clear that this is the first in a series of strikes. So we will remain focused on what happens in the coming hours, days, and weeks ahead. But clearly, this was the response that everyone has been waiting for.
Yeah, we're getting statements and responses coming out in the media gradually. An Iraqi military spokesperson, in a statement reported by Reuters, says these airstrikes constitute a violation of Iraqi sovereignty, undermine the efforts of the Iraqi government, and pose a threat that could lead Iraq and the region into dire consequences. And so far, there's been reports that 13 people have been killed in those strikes in eastern Syria, but as you mentioned, no indication that they are senior members of militia that are backed by Iran.
Yeah, exactly. And if the Iraqi government is talking about its sovereignty, well, maybe it shouldn't have allowed its territory to be used by Iran to stage attacks on US forces. The Iranians have basically infiltrated every aspect of Iraqi society and Iraqi government, to the point whereby I think that the question of Iraqi sovereignty needs to be looked at hard. The US had to respond to the attacks that killed 3 soldiers. For the US not to respond would have been a horrendous signal of weakness, not just to the Iranians, but also to Moscow and to Beijing. And I think it would have global consequences if the US hadn't responded effectively. Now, it's early days yet in terms of this campaign. How the Biden administration evolves this in terms of its operations in coming days and weeks, and how it essentially continues to attack the IRGC and the militias, will be very interesting to see. But my main concern is that these US strikes are there to degrade the capabilities of the militias to carry out further attacks, but they won't create credible deterrence to such attacks with Iran. And so I fear that at some point in the future, the Iranians will launch more attacks that could kill more US service people. And then the pressure on the Biden administration to do something far more decisive than what we're seeing today will be immense.
Just a last question for you, Malcolm. You said before that the US isn't looking for a real wide escalation in this. But we had a statement by US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin following the attacks on Iraq and Syria that says, "This is the start of our response. The President has directed additional actions to hold the IRGC and affiliated militias accountable for their attacks on US and coalition forces. These will unfold at times and places of our choosing." So telegraphing there that there's going to be follow-up actions. So that's kind of, you got to balance that with not wanting a wider escalation, right?
Exactly. So the US has to carefully calibrate its continuing strikes against the IRGC and the militias in a way that degrades their capability to carry out further attacks against US forces, but doesn't go over some sort of notional red line with Tehran that would lead to an immediate Iranian retaliation, either directly or indirectly through mining the Straits of Hormuz, for example. But I think that it's too early to say we can avoid that regional escalation. It may be that Tehran decides it must respond, and it could respond, for example, in the Red Sea with further attacks by the Houthis, or it could do something in the Strait of Hormuz. But the Biden administration is very clearly desperate to avoid escalation of this war. In one sense, that's entirely understandable. No one wants a regional war. But at the same time, it does cede the initiative to a degree to Tehran to see how far they can push the Biden administration and what the Biden administration's red line is.
Malcolm Davis, really appreciate your thoughts this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.